Welcome to the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop, woodworking with an Appalachian flair.
This is Jerill with the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop. If you do fine woodworking, at some point in time, you have to install hinges. It doesn't matter if you're building cabinets, if you're building period pieces, carcasses, drop leaf tables, boxes, chests. It doesn't matter what you're building, at some point in time, you will have to install hinges. There are 5 things you need to know before you install the hinges in order for the hinges to be the right type of hinge and be installed correctly. So let's look at those 5 things. The first thing is the type of hinge. Now there are many different types of hinges, and as a woodworker you need to educate yourself, become familiar with all the different type of hinges, so when you design a piece you're using the appropriate type of hinge for the piece that you're building. Now let me give you some examples. The type of hinge must match the design of the piece, and the type of hinge must match the function of the piece. Now a good example is a torsion hinge. This is a hinge which is designed for a chest or a box lid, and when you open it, wherever you let go of it, the hinge stays in that place. So that's function. So you need to be aware of that if you have a client wanting you to build a toy chest and they don't want the lid to fall on the child's fingers. Another example would be a European style hinge. You also have specialty hinges for half overlay or full overlay cabinet doors. You have corner hinges for small boxes. You have barrel hinges. These are really nice. You have small hinges which are designed to where they only open a little bit past 90 degrees. These are good for boxes. You have invisible hinges. So these go in like a drop leaf table where you do not see the hinge and they open up. And then you have some nice black iron surface mount hinges, double pivot hinges, piano hinges, butler tray hinges. There's a lot of different type of hinges. And as a woodworker, you need to be aware of all the different types. Some of them are specialty hinges and some of them are general use. But the type of hinge must match the piece that you are building. It must be period specific. You don't change a style on a piece of furniture. A lot of times the function of the piece or the design of the piece will dictate the style of hinge. So the second thing you need to be aware of is the size of the hinge. Now I know a lot of you are thinking all you do is measure the leaf of the hinge and make sure that it matches the thickness of the wood. Well, that is one way. Some hinges are sized by weight. Torsion box is a good example. Invisible hinge is a good example. As a woodworker, you need to know the weight of the item that is being hinged, and then the hinge is sized for that weight capacity. So the weight will dictate the size. The measurements can dictate the size. It must also be proportional to the piece you are building. This is a good example. A very small hinge like this would be nice for a small box. So proportional, it must be sized right. And of course, it must be sized based on the design and the function of the piece you're building. So the third thing you need to know is the finish. Again, a lot of times the design of the piece will dictate the finish, or the function of the piece will dictate the finish. The finish must be period correct if you're building a period piece. If you're building something and trying to make it look old, then you don't want a hinge that has a very shiny brass finish on it. So you may have to strip the finish off and get it to age to get the patina to match the old look that you're looking for. The finish on the hinge must match whatever hardware is located on that piece. It doesn't do any good to have a black iron finish on a hinge and then have a solid brass finish on an escutcheon. So the finish on all the hardware must match. So let's look at the fourth item that you need to do before you install the hinges. And that is you need to inspect the hinge. You've already determined the type, the size, and the finish. So now you've determined the particular hinge. So now you need to inspect that hinge. So before you inspect it, real quick, you need to know what the parts are. This is the leaf of the hinge. This is the barrel. Each individual piece here is a knuckle. And then inside the barrel is the pin, and it pivots on the pin. And that pin may have a top, or it may have none at all, or it could have a top and a bottom with the bottom screwing off to be able to remove the pin. If it has a top, then you need to be aware that that goes up so that gravity, it can't fall out. If it does not have a top on it, just has a pin in it, then it's possible, as that moves back and forth, if it's hung vertical, it's possible for the pin to work its way out and the hinge fail. So you need to inspect the hinge, but you also need to inspect the hardware that goes with the hinge. And an example would be the screws. And I'll show you here. You need to take the screws and put them in the slots where they go and see if they stick out above the surface. If they do, then that screw is not sized properly for that hinge. And what can happen when you have two screws in adjacent holes and you close it, if the heads protrude, then hinge will not close all the way and the hinge will bind. So you need to inspect the hardware that goes with it. And again, if you're building a period piece, don't use screws that have a Phillips head or a square drive. Use the appropriate screw for the period piece that you're building. Now when you inspect it, the main thing you want to look at is see if there's any play. And here's an example, this piece right here. You can see the leaf moving back and forth. That's too much play or too much slop. So that hinge is not good for a piece, fine woodworking piece. This one has no slop or movement in it, so this one is a lot tighter. Also, operate the hinge, make sure it operates good and smooth, and there's no rough spots. So after you inspect the hinge, then the fifth thing you need to do is you need to determine where to install the hinge and how to install the hinge. Now you need to think about this long before you actually install the hinge. So where you install the hinge may be dictated by the design of the furniture, the piece you're building, or it could be dictated by the hinge itself. This is a good example. This little hinge right here goes in the corner of a small box, and that's the only place it can go. So you need to determine where to install the hinge. Make sure you measure and align the hinges so they are visually complementing the piece. If you measure down 3 inches from the top and measure up 3 inches from the bottom for a cabinet door, if the rail on the top is 3 inches wide and the rail on the bottom is 4 inches wide, then those hinges will not look good because of the different sizes in the rails. So the design of the piece may dictate where the hinges go. Also, you need to determine the number of the hinges. And again, make sure they're all aligned properly. Sometimes you will have to install 3 hinges instead of 2. So when you go to install it, you need to determine whether you're going to install it using a machine, a jig, hand tools, or specialty tools. And a lot of times this will dictate exactly where you install it, because you have to have room to get these items in there to install the hinge. So all of these things will come into play in helping you determine the correct hinge to use and the correct application. So let's review those 5 things again. You need to know the type of the hinge. You need to know the size of the hinge. You need to know the finish that's on the hinge. You need to inspect the hinge and the hardware, and you need to determine where and how to install the hinge. If you follow these 5 things, then you will be very successful in installing hinge on your woodworking project. This is Jerill Vance with the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop reminding you, be proud of your Appalachian heritage.